Well, I'm wondering, Bob, if we could start off by maybe asking a question with to frame in sort of an answer of how do you talk to, or what do you say to other men in particular about why the work that you do around sort of trying to understand and research sort of the impact of pornography? Why is that both important to you, and why do you think it's important for men to think about what function that kind of media plays in our lives?
Sure. Well, I think there are really two arguments to make to men about our use of what I would call the sexual exploitation industries: stripping, pornography, prostitution. One is what I would call the argument from justice. That is, if we really believe the principles we claim to believe about equality, about justice, about fairness, about mutual respect, then we cannot engage in buying the sexuality of women. It's inconsistent with the principles we claim to hold. There is a justice question. But there's also an argument from self-interest, which is once you get beyond the kind of bravado, the macho posturing that men often do with each other, and that I've done in my past as well, and I know what it feels like to play that game with the boys. But once we get past that, most of us are deeply conflicted about these industries, about the fact that our sexuality has been so fused to the objectification of women and the commodification of sex. We don't feel good about it for two reasons. One is that, from my point of view, that doesn't meet our own sexual needs. And number two, it keeps us stuck in this masculinity trap where we're constantly trying to prove that we're man enough. And that's a game you can never win. And so I think both for political reasons, in the sense of political justice, men should resist the pornography industry. But I also think there's an argument from self-interest that we have to make as well. And increasingly, as I talk to younger men especially, they resonate to that. They've grown up in a world hyper-sexualized, hyper-masculinized, and they don't feel that it fulfills their needs, and they don't feel they can live up to it.
You know, when several weeks ago I sent you an email about there was a so-called porn debate that took place here between somebody from this, a Christian minister and Ron Jeremy, which really isn't a debate, but it seems like in many ways that sort of exemplified how often when conversations about pornography, it's sort of framed within that. I mean, why do you think sort of, that's the case from people who even claim to be kind of anti-pornography activists, and where do you think the debate needs to go?
Well, for years, the debate about pornography in the culture was between conservative, often religious objections to pornography and liberal defenses of pornography, one arguing that this kind of sex was immoral and inappropriate. Implicitly, sex should be confined to the heterosexual marriage. And the other side saying, no, any sexual expression is acceptable between consenting adults. Well, what exploded that kind of argument was the feminist critique in the late 70s and early 80s, which said, no, this isn't about imposing some narrow view of sexual morality, nor is it about sexual expression or freedom. It's about, within a male-dominant society, how sex is one place where men dominate. That is, where sexuality becomes a site of struggle. It's about the eroticizing of domination and subordination. Well, that, for me at least, totally changed, sort of blew the door off that old liberal versus conservative debate. I think it was the most productive way to engage the question of pornography and the sexual exploitation industries more generally. But we see how fast both the conservative side and the liberal side rejected feminist critiques, and we're happy to go back to that old liberal conservative debate, which is now where we're stuck again, with one added twist that much of the discussion about pornography now in this culture, because pornography has become so normalized, is simply about economics, the business of pornography. So you still have this liberal conservative debate going on, but within a culture that kind of acknowledges that porn is just one more industry. Meanwhile, the real way to, I think, understand and explore the issue, the feminist critique of pornography, has been marginalized. So a lot of the work we're doing now is to try to bring that back into the debate. And I think that's good for women. I think it's good for men. I think it's good for the culture more generally.
I was talking with somebody recently who also had read your book, Getting Off, and they expressed some kind of concern, or they weren't sure how to deal with the fact that you interject yourself, your own kind of history or your own struggle and your own evolution about this. And I said to them that I really appreciated it because it just made it seem much more human in terms of as another man understanding what effect this has had on me. I mean, why did you choose to, if I can ask you, to sort of personalize it within that book?
When I write about pornography, I reflect on my own experience because I think, number one, it's responsible. When you come out of a position of privilege and power, a man in patriarchy, or as a white person in a white supremacist culture, or as a middle-class person in capitalism, I think we have to always be thinking about how this has affected us, what's our accountability in the system. It's too easy to critique systems that we're embedded in from a distance. So one reason I do write about myself is in that sense kind of moral. I feel I'm morally obligated to be self-critical. The second reason is kind of political in the sense that it's not very effective to preach at other people about what's wrong with them when you haven't gone through a similar process yourself. And my experience is that when I focus on myself rather than pointing the finger at other men, it creates a space. It says, listen, I know we're all in this together. We all were raised in the same culture. I was born in 1958 in the post-Playboy world. I watched pornography and looked at pornography as a young man, as a child. It helped shape my sexual imagination. I struggled just like everybody else. To pretend otherwise would be, number one, to be dishonest with myself and with other people. And number two would be to undercut in fact, the basis of the critique, which is it's not about the failures of an individual so much as a collective, a culture that creates a certain conception of masculinity and femininity within a sexual context and then sells us a certain image. Well, I've had to struggle with that as much as anyone, and to pretend otherwise, I think, would be dishonest. And of course, as someone who comes out of academic life, where you're encouraged to be dishonest, you're encouraged to be falsely neutral, and as someone who came out of journalism before I was an academic, where again you're encouraged to be sort of detached, I just have always resisted that. It doesn't seem authentic to me.
Maybe the next question would be, in terms of the cost to you personally, again, choosing to go down this path of which you can't talk about it, you can't critique it without yourself consuming it in a sense by looking at this stuff. I mean, I've done media studies, and I've done mostly looking at like news, like hours of news every day and whatnot. And people say, "Why would you choose it?" So they're like, "Yeah, it has an effect on you." But I'm just wondering how you have dealt with that. I mean, how it has affected you by choosing to kind of consciously look at this stuff, even as difficult as it may be.
Yeah, it's the subject of many jokes from men about how I study pornography and then have to look at it, and men will say to me, "That sounds like a great job, to get paid to look at pornography." And of course, the minute that you move from being a consumer of pornography who is using it for sexual pleasure into being a critic and looking at it, then it becomes a very different enterprise. And you start to see the underlying misogyny, the woman-hating that saturates pornography. You start to see the way it constructs men as a kind of brute animal. And you say to yourself, oh my goodness, I've spent my life trying to fill that role in relationship to women. Is this what and it's not fun. And then you start to see the brutality, the denigration of women, the cruelty of it, that when you used it as a consumer, you didn't see. And I can say that it isn't, it's not a trivial question, and I've dealt with it in really two ways. One is I've limited my exposure. I do periodic studies of the content of video pornography, usually about every 3 years, and then that's it. So I confine that to a very concentrated period of viewing, and only every few years. And that itself is very difficult. The aftermath of that week of viewing, I try to stay away from other people for a while, because it really does take its toll on me emotionally. Beyond the actual viewing, just constantly being engaged with and arguing about and talking about it also can be very emotionally draining, because when you bring it up in public, then you're creating a space for other people, and it is very intense. So I deal with it, number one, by limiting my viewing, and number two, I think by realizing there's a point at which it's good to stop. So the research that led to the book was what I hope will be my last study of video pornography, quite frankly, because number one, I just don't know how long I can do it. It does wear you down in a certain way. And in fact, I intended to watch a little more of it than I did for this last one, and sort of midway through it I just said enough. I was trying to listen to my own sort of emotional and embodied life and stop. And so what I'd like now is, especially for younger men, to take up this, because I'm done. I'm tired and I'm old.
I really appreciated how you kind of began the conversation today at the presentation around sort of, looking, just in terms of like you would any sort of media studies in a sense. And if you were trying to, speak to, again, you're addressing parents or men in particular, and you're trying to look at this from just kind of a media literacy kind of point of view, which, tries to advocate for deconstructing and so forth. But you don't see a whole lot of media literacy proponents talking about pornography, and I'm wondering if you could respond to why you think that might be, but also if I was coming at it from a media literacy angle, how might one approach pornography?
It's a bit of a paradox in a sense, because if you take people who have generally progressive politics, they're trying to expand the scope of freedom and justice in the world. One of the places many of us who would count ourselves in that group look is media, because in a media-saturated, mass-mediated culture, it's rather obvious you have to look at how the world is constructed through media. And so we do things like critique the implicit racism in a lot of Hollywood action films, for instance, that are always constructing the Arab, the Muslim, as the terrorist, as the source of all violence and evil in the world. Well, we look at that and we say there's some implicit racism here. We look at the way Hollywood films often objectify women and trivialize women in that sense. We look at the way that capitalism, the buying and selling of everything, so infuses our media system. And those are important things to look at. So we have misogyny and patriarchy. We have racism and white supremacy. We have the commodification of everything in corporate capitalism. Well, there's no better example of that than pornography, where overt women-hating, overt racism, and the commodification of even the most intimate spaces of our emotional and physical lives are bought and sold in the market. Well, I think I would agree, for people with progressive politics, and I mean that in a broad sense, concerned with making the world a better place, should understand that a critique of pornography is central to media criticism in the context of sexism, racism, and capitalism. Yet many of those same people who would critique those things in those other media genres are fearful of pornography. Why is that? Well, one reason is because the pornography industry has done a very good job of painting anyone who's critical of their products as a prude, as a conservative religious nut, as a, someone who's got their own sexual hang-ups. And that discourages a certain number of people. The other thing is, because so much of the past critique of pornography has been from a conservative point of view and been repressive and tried to use the law to shut down not only these very misogynistic porn producers, but a whole lot of healthy sexual expression, people are understandably wary about it, and I think that's important. There also is a First Amendment question. How do we treat sexually explicit media that seem to be connected to the harms that come from sexism and racism, for instance? So on the one hand, I think people have been have allowed themselves to be bullied by the industry into being silent. On the other hand, people have legitimate concerns about some of these things. But the other thing we can't ignore is that a whole lot of people who are progressive, especially progressive men, are also pornography users. That is, their own sexuality is very much connected to their use of sexually explicit media. And when you critique pornography, let's not be shy about saying it. You're suggesting that that is no longer an acceptable way to experience sexual pleasure. You're saying to men who use pornography, it's time to stop. And we know that, you know, whatever we are, whether we're straight or gay, celibate or sexually active, we know that our sexuality is crucial to us. And if your whole life you've been essentially socialized to experience sexual pleasure in a certain way, through media, through the subordination of women, and then somebody says you have to stop, well, that's threatening. I mean, that's, you know, it's true. It was certainly difficult for me. It took me a long time to come to understand the feminist critique, even before I endorsed it, simply because I think I intuitively knew it was a threat to the way I had learned to be sexual. And I also, you know, don't want to be naive. One doesn't get from being rooted in a sexuality, a commodified sexuality and male domination, to some other way of experiencing sexuality and intimacy, you know, overnight. It's a long struggle. In some ways, it's a struggle I'm still engaged in, 20 years after first thinking about this. But so there is a cost in that sense. But the flip side of that, of course, is if one is willing to struggle, it takes you to a place that, for me at least, has been far richer and deeper and more intimate. That is, my own personal life is not only one of struggle, but it's also one of moments of transcendence, of moments of experiencing something I had never experienced before. And that's powerful. And we always have to keep in mind, whatever the way in which it looks risky, there's also a payoff to taking those risks, which is true of most of life. You know, the things that end up being the most satisfying and fulfilling are often the things that scare us the most initially.
The subtitle of your book, Pornography and the End of Masculinity, I kind of asked a question earlier today at the presentation, and the first time I kind of came across that idea was at a NOMAS conference, and John Stoltenberg was speaking, and I think maybe right at the time he came out with that book called The End of Masculinity, and
The End of Manhood.
The End of Manhood, right? Yeah, it seems that that's a really hard thing for particularly men to think about this idea that maybe we should just stop thinking about trying to be a man and just try to be human. I'm just wondering if you could speak more about that.
For me, I had read some of those books and articles, both from men and women, about transcending this obsession with masculinity. And for me, it really hit home right after 9/11. I was on a pro-feminist men's listserv, and a man, actually a very well-known theorist of gender from a pretty pro-feminist position, said maybe it's time in the aftermath of 9/11, as we saw men engage in such caring and compassionate behavior. There was a story of the man who stayed with, in the World Trade Center, who stayed with a co-worker in a wheelchair, knowing he was going to sacrifice his own life for that moment of compassion with someone who was more vulnerable. And so this man on the listserv said, well, maybe it's time, in addition to all the negative things that come with masculinity, the domination, the conquest, the aggression, we should remember that masculinity is also these other things. Compassion, strength out of caring for others, for instance. And my response was, well, yes, but what makes those distinctly masculine traits? So we want to say that masculinity can be about strength with compassion. And my first response is yes. And are women ever strong with compassion? In fact, all of the things that we might want to redefine masculinity as are not traits of men, distinctive to men. They are human traits that are apportioned depending on who you are, where you come from, how you've been socialized, pretty much across the board. And so I think this obsession with defining what is masculine is dangerous, because in the end, if you're obsessed with constructing a definition of masculinity in a world that's already structured by male dominance, that's only going to end up replicating male dominance, because it's going to be in a system that assigns greater value to those things masculine. So no matter how we decide we are going to define masculinity within an existing patriarchal system, it's going to mean privileging masculinity over femininity, defining the two in opposition to each other, and that can only, it seems to me, lead to a deepening of patriarchy. So the task of transcending that isn't to pretend that men and women are exactly the same. Obviously, the difference in fundamental reproductive organs, the hormonal differences, they have an effect. I mean, certainly, at least until we know more, one can assume certainly they have effects on us psychologically, let's say. But we really don't know much about that. And instead of obsessing about the differences, why don't we look at what's common? And what we see, of course, is that there's far more that we have in common than there is that separates us.
It seems to me that the notion of just trying to really nurture and find out what it really means to be more human is sort of one of those sort of like, what do we do after hearing sort of all the sort of the kind of really difficult stuff about the impact of pornography. What have you found in terms of how men respond, and for that matter, how women respond to that part of that conversation about trying to, again, change the direction of a conversation about getting away from masculine and feminine to more just what it means to be human?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we should acknowledge that men often have trouble with the notion of giving up masculinity. But it's also true that women often have trouble giving up the concept of femininity, because if you've been raised with that as your set of background assumptions, it can be just as difficult. And I think part of what's hopeful is when men and women can both talk about that. So for instance, I did a presentation once on the subject of pornography, and a woman, and this was a woman who was a feminist working in the rape crisis movement, said, you know, it's just as true that I've internalized a lot of conceptions of what it means to be a woman in the appropriate feminine ways, and that she had had to struggle with that with her own husband. And the result was, however, it deepened their relationship. They had to deal with not only what do you think you're supposed to do because you're a man, but how do I think I'm supposed to respond because I'm a woman? Well, once you can be honest about that, I think, you know, whole new areas of connection, communication, and intimacy open up. They certainly have in my own life. I mean, I can speak from experience to some degree, not because I think I've gotten everything figured out right, but because when we step into those spaces, they're a little scary because we're not sure what's out there. In my experience, that uniformly, that has led to something better. Not always clear, not always easy, but always better. Excuse me.
Earlier when we were talking too about another aspect of this is that when I sort of mentioned how I first met you was at a kind of an anti-occupation conference, and you made the comment about that for a lot of folks, you know, even on the left, particularly a lot of men on the left, there doesn't seem to be either the same kind of interest or no interest at all in sort of an anti-pornography fight. One, why do you think that is, in part? And then secondly, are there ways to talk about anti-pornography work in the same ways that we talk about anti-war or anti-racism work?
Yeah. Well, let's remember the feminist anti-pornography movement is very new. It emerges in the late 70s. It doesn't take form in a political sense until the early 80s. And within a decade, because of the power of the pornography lobby and associated lobbies, it was gone. So we're talking about a movement that's emerging and developing a vocabulary. And I think one of the things that this new wave of anti-pornography organizing out of a feminist perspective has done is try to link it up to other issues more explicitly. I think feminism is always a multi-issue political perspective. And the anti-pornography movement and the women who were part of it were always rooted in an interest beyond just pornography, or even beyond just gender. But now I think we have to do that much more explicitly. So for instance, I talk about the misogyny in pornography, the way those images are sort of saturated with woman-hating. But I've never done a talk where I also don't talk about the way they are racist, connecting up questions of the domination we see through gender and the domination we see through race. I try to always talk about it in the context of capitalism. As a progressive leftist, I think you can't talk about the way power operates in this culture without talking about the nature of not only capitalism, but I would name it as a very predatory corporate capitalism. Okay. You can talk about it in the context of first world domination of the developing world. One of the things that we saw after the fall of the Soviet Union, pornography prostitution flooded the former Soviet bloc countries in Eastern Europe. One of the things we see in pornography, much like in other capitalist enterprises, is shifting production to places where there's low-cost labor. So you see pornography producers saying, well, I can go to Brazil and shoot for half the cost. So let's go use those women who are more vulnerable by virtue of being impoverished in a third world society, let's say. All of these things connect up, and we can start to see patterns. The issue of pornography is not unique. It involves questions about the domination of women by men, the domination of non-white people by white people, the predation of corporate capitalism, and a history of imperialism, first world domination. It seems pretty clear to me this is a fundamentally left progressive issue. And we're trying to develop that kind of language more explicitly, so that not only we can draw in more people to resist the pornography industry, but also so the pornography issue can be a vehicle to, let's call it what it is, radicalize the American population. You know, as a progressive person who's been politically active now for the better part of the last 2 decades, you know, we haven't won a lot of victories. And one of the questions is, how do you find traction in the culture? If you're a political organizer, it's not enough to be right. For instance, for 20 years I've been right. Okay, I think I've been right. It would also be nice to win now and then. And to win, one has to deal with the culture you live in and where it's at ideologically. And that means you have to look for places to get traction where you can engage people with things that they care about, sometimes very viscerally care about. So for instance, I observe that parents, people who have especially children coming into their sexually active years, are very concerned about the way pornography is structuring those children's conception of gender and sexuality. So there's a place I can get traction with parents who might not be radical, might not be leftist, might not even be progressive, but understand there's an issue they have to care about, and that can become a vehicle to a broader politics. So I look at it in a sense from both angles, that pornography in and of itself matters. There's a material question about the way it structures our world. And at the same time, it's a vehicle to a broader politics that can engage us in a bigger critique as well.